abuse and exploitation of Africa has got to come into an end. The revolution for Africa's liberation has arrived. And those who don't jump on the bandwagon, your days are numbered in Africa. Thank you.
And it does appear that sometimes what people do intend for bad turns out to work out for good. You were relieved of your AU permanent representative job because powers that be were uncomfortable with your stance on neo-colonization, especially with the overbearing influence of France on states it once colonized. But it appears that no one saw the outrage that would greet that, and even how much more popular your gospel was going to get. Did you envisage all of this at all since 2019?
Not at all. Even during my tenure, I was simply delivering on my mandate. As a medical doctor, I went to Washington, of course, reluctantly. But of course, once a doctor, always a doctor. I started making diagnosis while I was in Washington. And my diagnosis, first and foremost, became the ignorance that we had of our understanding of Africa, not only as Africans, not as Black people around the world, but even members of Congress themselves, the US government, they really don't understand Africa. So I set out to address the issue of the ignorance about what was going on in Africa, educating the African diaspora primarily, and secondarily, those in the US government and anybody else that wished to listen to the message. Because I felt that that was the root cause of what was going on in Africa, the lack of understanding and appreciation of what was really going on in Africa, and more importantly, identifying the root causes. And for Africa, I came to the conclusion that France was the biggest risk to peace and security and overall African development, particularly in West Africa, because of one particular agreement that they would make the African heads of state sign when they were receiving their independence. It was a horrible, continues to be a horrible document that sadly, it has been allowed to continue to this very day, to the serious detriment of the Africans. So I set out to educate the Africans about France. Others would say, why didn't you talk about the British and all other colonizers? Yes, we would speak about them as well. But the one that is leading the pack, the one that is taking the crown of the abuse and exploitation, it is France. And I felt very strongly that if France can come to the table and also renegotiate those contracts, if France can leave Africa, that would be the beginning of true liberation. And I'm talking economic liberation of the African continent. So France is leading the pack because of its deep roots within Africa, because of the agreements that the heads of states were made to sign during independence of Africa.
Yeah, by that document, I know you were referring to the Pact on the Continued Colonization. I think you've made reference to it in quite a number of your speeches. The continued colonization of African states. Is that it?
That's correct, yes. That continues to be in place today. And through that document, African countries, the former French colonies, upwards, it used to be 85% of their bank reserves had to be deposited with the French treasury. It's now down to around 50 to 60%. To this day, poor countries are sending their bank reserves to France. To this day, poor countries, the first right of refusal of all contracts, public, private, large, small, French companies, the first right of refusal. To this day, all minerals discovered yet to be discovered, France has the first right of refusal. To this day, those former French colonies, all their military must be trained by France. All their military equipment must be purchased from France. And France has a presence in their countries and can invade those countries without notice should they feel their French interests are being violated. So at every level, the document is horrible and it remains in place today. I was horrified when I began to see the extent to which people simply did not know. So I made that my mission number one. Because as a medical doctor, if you're dealing with let's say, an accident situation, you first assess the heart. Does the patient have a heartbeat? Is the patient breathing? You don't worry about the broken bone. You don't worry about other peripheral damages. You start with the core. If the patient is breathing, if the patient has a heartbeat, you must revive them, get a heartbeat, get the lungs, get them breathing, and then you can deal with the other peripheral issues. So I felt the heartbeat of what was ailing Africa started with France. If we can deal with what France is doing in Africa, dealing with the rest of the colonizers will be easy, for their roots are not as entrenched into Africa as the French roots to this day. Be it as it may, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of colonization left the African feeling inferior, feeling they're incapable, admiring everything else that somebody else is doing, that everything African is undesirable, that we're always looking to what those who don't look like us are doing, and we want to emulate what they are doing. Mm-hmm. That, to me, the biggest risk to Africa's development is the mind. I would say the biggest problem right now is the mind. I still believe it is the mind. Secondly, the average African leader is fighting with their hands tied behind their back, and in some cases also blindfolded. I really don't want us to get lost in the mud about peripheral issues. Remember what I said, you get into an accident situation, first you assess the heartbeat. Does the patient have a pulse? Is the patient breathing? We worry about the blown up eye, we worry about the broken bone later. We must go to the root causes. If a president of a country, my daughter, let me take you, you become the president of Nigeria today, with all good intentions, you are told, do not talk about your military, because we got that under our control as France. Do not talk about your financial resources. We control your central bank. We manage your financial policies. Do not talk about your finances. We have that under our control. Do not talk about your natural resources. Those belong to us. All your contracts, we shall choose and decide who builds your country. Now, if you stay away from all that, you are not free to run your country. What do you have? You've given up your natural resources. You've given up control of your financial resources. You've given up control of your military. What kind of a leader are you? I don't care what intentions you have. I don't care how Pan-African you are. I don't care how smart you are. Your hands are tied behind your back and you're blindfolded and you're supposed to engage in a fight and win. How? So I'm saying, before we even talk about how good a leader you are, I can tell you, I was joking with a friend. I said, I'm pretty sure right now, President Bazoum is probably happy. Because what kind of country was he leading? He had no power. He had nothing to control. That's a joke of a leadership. So once we understand that, we then go back and say, okay, fine. With whatever you were given, what have you done with it? Now I'm ready to start putting blame on the leader to say, okay, you had a small budget for healthcare. What did you do? Did you at least build one hospital during that year? Now, if it's a foreign minister, a minister of health, who is now failing to do something with that budget for 1 year, that's why we start putting the blame on local levels to say, yes, as a minister of health, you were given a budget. Show us at least one health hospital you built this year. Show us what you have done. So yes, we do have our own leadership issues. Leadership within very limited spaces. And even in those countries that are not former French colonies, we still have major presence and control by the multinationals who existed during colonization. They just went low, but they're still by and large running African countries. They're the ones who are the major employers, and they can manipulate the politics because of their presence within the country. They can gang up against a country and decide suddenly 10 of them, 15 of them can leave the country, taking away with them hundreds and thousands of jobs. So they still have some soft ways, underhanded ways of dealing and upsetting African economies. It still goes back to the former colonizers. So as we talk about our issues in Africa, let's not look at them in isolation. Let's understand in a holistic way all the issues that are coming to play when we end up with millions of youth unemployed. Why? Understand the entire process. Millions of children going to bed on an empty stomach. Millions of children dying. Women dying while giving birth to another life. Let's understand the entire genesis of what is going on. Because the tendency is for us to be pigeonholed and follow into this rabbit hole of a tiny little issue without understanding the genesis of that issue. And that is the holistic approach that I want the new African to have, to fully have a depth of understanding of what is going on. So we know when we are fighting, is it a fight that is local, that goes to my house? Is this my village fight? Is it my providential provincial fight? Is it a country fight? Is it a sub-African, sub-regional fight? Or is it a continental fight? At every level, there are certain tools in our toolbox that we need to pull out. But to think you can take a village issue and apply it to a continental issue, that is stupid, that is ignorant, and we want our people to be politically mature and understand what fight this is, where we call for unity at the village level, unity at the national level, unity at the party level, unity at the continental level. We were made to walk away from our own traditional values, from our own culture, from our own indigenous ancestral leadership values. We are following their guidebook. We are following their ways of leadership. What kind of leadership tells you this is democratic? What is democratic about France forcing African countries, bullying African countries into giving up their financial resources? My daughter, answer me. What is democratic about that? What is democratic about France occupying African countries without their authority? What is democratic about France taking natural resources out of Africa? 90%, 95% of Niger's lithium is powering Europe and France. What is democratic about that? So you're saying, oh, forget that democracy. Let's just concentrate on this little bitty democracy. It is stupid. It goes back to the colonized mind. It doesn't make any sense. Before we can talk about democracy in Africa, let's practice democracy from an international point of view. Africa is not going to Europe to steal from anybody. Africa is not going to Europe to invade anybody. Let's go there first. So before you can talk about that, tell me why 90% of Niger is not electrified when their electricity, their lithium, is powering Europe. Answer that. Now we can talk about democracy. Let's not be stupid. Reality is, what is happening in Niger is those students in that dining room. It's now a mutiny. They want to keep their lunch. They're saying this time it's going to be different. We just want to keep our lunch. What happens is if Niger does it alone, they're not going to succeed because it's too small a country. It's already fighting against monstrous forces. That is why this moment is calling for everybody to support Niger. We must come together as a continent. We must speak with one voice. If we do not speak with one voice, even those who tried, are you trying to say Kwame Nkrumah didn't try? He tried, but he was alone. He was not supported by many African countries. Had Africa come together, when at the African Union in Addis Ababa in 1963, when Kwame Nkrumah and the Casablanca group were saying Africa for the Africans and African Union now, had the Casablanca succeeded back in 1963, Africa would be sitting in a different position. So my message to the Africans is, any African country that tries to stand up against the West alone without the support of other African countries, they are not going to succeed. Make no mistake about that. We are a tiny little dot in the ocean. But when we come together as a continent, that's why Niger must be supported, Mali must be supported. They have taken a position that is right, a position that is good for the Africans, a position that simply says exploitation of the continent can no longer continue. My daughter, you tell me, are you okay with all our natural resources creating millions of jobs for European kids when our kids cannot get jobs because our natural resources are not getting value addition? Are you okay with that? Do you call that democracy? We have now put a system in place where if we do not wake up to the reality, we are going to be handing Africa back to the colonizers, this time on a silver platter. Who has the funds to build the transcontinental highway? It's not us, Black people. Who has the funds and the capacity to bring about the development, to build the ports, to build the infrastructure that is required? It is not us. So who are the companies that are getting the contracts to implement the African Continental Free Trade Area? They're Chinese companies. They're Middle Eastern companies. They're European companies. They're Indian companies. It's everybody else except us. I have not seen a push to promote Africans coming together as a continent. I've not seen a push to line up the opportunities and say 60% of these must be occupied, must be run. These contracts must be given to Africans, must be given to Black people. I've not seen that document that's demanding that X amount must stay with the people. That is where I see the problem going to be. If we do not manage the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we are going to be handing Africa back to the colonizers, this time on a silver platter. That is my fear, and I hope it does not come to fruition. We need to make sure that we speak very strongly to it. We need a document that says, at a minimum, 60% of all the contracts must go to the Africans. And then we set out a plan to make sure that the Africans are educated and informed about the process of getting these contracts. We must also be very clear about how to mobilize the funding so Africa can be built by the Africans for the Africans. We do not mind foreign direct investment. We do not mind our friends coming to help us, but Chinese do not look to outsiders to build China. Europeans do not look to outsiders to build Europe. No one else looks outside their region to build their regions. Why do we Africans, why must we always look outside? But also, the Secretary General for the African Continental Free Trade Area must go the extra mile to educate and inform the Africans, and also open doors for those opportunities for Africans to build the Africa that they want through the African Continental Free Trade Area. If that is not done, colonization 202 is around the corner. This African Union is like a dead entity, and something needs to happen there. African Union is one entity that could speak on behalf of the continent, that could speak and call out those who are abusing Africa. It is the one place that we could actually let the world know that the exploitation and abuse of the African continent has got to come to an end. That voice is not there. We look forward to continued work as we build the Africa that we want, and as we also stand up on the tallest mountain and tell the world abuse and exploitation of Africa has got to come into an end. The revolution for Africa's liberation has arrived, and those who don't jump on the bandwagon, your days are numbered in Africa. Thank you.